There is much debate concerning whether modern cockpits augment or diminish safety. But the high-tech equipment is not to blame, it's often the pilots who don't manage their resources properly. What often happens is that pilots don't take the time to learn the equipment thoroughly. When the instrument does something that a pilot hasn't seen before, or something that needs to be changed quickly, too much concentration is focused on the avionics. As a result, situational awareness suffers, and more alarmingly, aircraft control. Alternatively, pilots can be proactive to reduce these risks. It's interesting to note that most of these incidents occur not because of inadequate fuel for the flight, but instead, pilots try to push it just a little bit too far, running out of fuel just short of the destination. The problem with fuel management is that pilots think of fuel in terms of distance, particularly during planning. Instead, fuel should be thought of in terms of time. The best way to implement this philosophy is to determine how much fuel will be available once you're airborne, in hours and minutes. Of course, an allotment of fuel should be set aside for a divert, then a little more for reserve. Another common error made by pilots is forgetting to use the I'm Safe checklist, which stands for illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion, or eating. Sick pilots have no place in a cockpit, because they are more susceptible to spatial disorientation. Don't be tempted to hide your illness with medication and go flying, as a lot of over-the-counter medications can make you a zombie. Stress is commonplace in this fast-paced world, but there is a point at which it becomes too much that it's a distraction. When your mind is outside the cockpit, you're bound to make mistakes, so it's probably a good idea to reschedule the flight. There certainly is no time that your mind is farther outside the cockpit than if you've been drinking. The effects of alcohol obviously are detrimental to good cockpit decision-making, and alcohol can affect your flying ability. Fatigue is a no-go item, but pilots weaken their minds through a lack of sleep all the time. But there are things that pilots can do to mitigate fatigue. If you know you've got a morning flight, you need to go to bed early. Being well rested by planning ahead makes a big difference, it's a no-brainer. Emotion, just like stress, is something that everyone has to deal with, but there are times when it too is at a level that is intolerable in a cockpit. If you reach it, cancel the flight. Finally, make sure you've eaten something and stay well hydrated. A physiologically sound pilot makes better decisions than a hungry or thirsty one. Some pilots get into the mindset that flying is like riding a bicycle, something you can do easily out of memory. While it is true most of the time, you'll remember to do everything required, if you use the checklist. Sure, you can do cockpit flows or whatever other technique you like, but back up your actions. Don't just blindly read the checklist either. As you go through each item, verify that they are accomplished. Those who are prepared are well equipped to deal with the tasks at hand. Typically, the level of pre-flight preparation is proportional to how smoothly the flight goes. Often, pilots take off with no planning whatsoever. That's when they have a tendency to get tangled in temporary flight restrictions or nasty weather. Countless pilots often neglect to check density altitude, even though they're planning a departure from a short trip with only a field elevation of 6,000 feet on a hot 100-degree day. Weight and balance is also something that is often dismissed. It's amazing how many pilots mess up pre-flight inspections. A cursory walk around simply to kick the tires so you can hurry up and light the fires is beckoning for trouble. Take your time during your pre-flight. If you find yourself inspecting in haste, slow down. Take a comprehensive look at everything, with a checklist in hand, to make sure you don't miss anything. When you finish, scrutinize the details, to make sure there isn't a door that isn't flush with the fuselage, or a red flag apparatus still on the pitot tube. Pilots are notorious show-offs, especially with low-level maneuvers. The problem isn't just flying low to the ground, It's a combination of flying too slow and in too tight of a turn that causes crashes. If you do end up having to fly close to the ground, fly the plane like you would do when you're close to the ground at other times, such as during landing. In addition, pay close attention to the minimum safe altitudes laid out in the FARs, and monitor your speed and bank angle. You certainly wouldn't want to try a 60-degree bank turn with no flaps at a slow speed when turning base to final. Many pilots seem to have an affinity for deficient communication. This difficulty of communicating comes in several forms. When dealing with air traffic control, pilots tend to hear what they want to hear. The saying goes that a good pilot anticipates what is coming next. However, this profound skill can trick the mind into hearing what is expected regardless of what actually filters into the headset. Also, misunderstandings between ATC and pilots happen all the time. This plays into the most knotty communication quandary of all, a lack of communication. It's silly that a pilot would rather keep quiet than ask for help or clarification. If there is any question on what was said, ask for elucidation. It's better to find out if you've misheard something immediately, rather than finding out your license is going to be suspended later. Another common pilot error is controlled flight into terrain. Low-level clouds or fog reduce the visibility of the ground, and if the pilot doesn't do a good job of keeping up with the terrain, an unpleasant meeting with the ground is more likely. Another time when controlled flight into terrain can be a factor, is during nighttime. Pilots seem to have a knack of flying into trees and hills after the sun goes down. If you can't see the terrain, you must be able to point to your position on a sectional, en route chart, approach plate, etc. The more a pilot knows about it, the better. Stormy clouds and fog aren't inherently dangerous, it's just that some pilots who fly into them don't know how to fly on instruments. This is due to them being overconfident, because some believe that they don't need to stay current, or that their hours under the hood are good enough. Social pressure also plays a role, because the passengers want to get to the destination, and pressure the pilots to continue. In addition, some pilots are mission-oriented, sometimes a little too much.